At a charity gala, my husband decided to humiliate me. He put a joke item up for auction: dinner with my boring wife. The starting bid? $1. But then a stranger stood up from the back row. Jasmine felt a heaviness in her soul that didn't come from the elegant, perfectly fitted gown, but from a dull premonition that had been plaguing her all morning. It was the sensation of standing on thin ice, ready to crack beneath the weight of 7 silent years. This nagging feeling of emptiness and betrayal had become her constant companion, an invisible shadow that clung to her even in the brightest moments. The dress, custom-tailored in midnight blue velvet, had been Sterling's choice, not because it suited her, but because it served as the perfect, understated backdrop for his own brilliance. She was the silent, dark pedestal upon which his golden ego could be enthroned. The charity auction, the annual event where his firm, Vanguard Equity Solutions, VES, gathered the city's high society, had always felt more like an obligation than a celebration to her. She sat at her table, the expensive fabric of the dress seeming to choke her, and watched Sterling, her husband. She didn't see the charming department head everyone else admired, but the actor whose mask only cracked for her. "He is just a facade," a cold voice whispered in Jasmine's head. "And you handed him the blueprints for that fake building." He fluttered from group to group like a colorful butterfly. He joked effortlessly, shook hands, and showered women with hollow compliments. His smile was as broad as his limitless ambition, which glittered in his eyes, greedy and cold. He was a dazzling, perfect man for the public, who turned into a vacuum at home, sucking up all her energy. Jasmine watched him capture the attention of senior executives, striving to be the center of attention, and she knew how it usually ended, with a hollow triumph built on her invisible foundation. His success was their bitter, shared secret. All the brilliant reports, the complex financial models, the strategic analyses he presented so dramatically in meetings had passed through her hands. Sleepless nights, filled with numbers and analysis, were her lot, but he always reaped the rewards. It was the bitter rent for their marriage. She didn't grumble, nor did she demand recognition. Her love for Sterling, blind and all-consuming, had once been reward enough for her. Or had it only seemed that way? In truth, it had been the fear of emptiness, the fear of being nothing outside his shadow. A trauma deeply rooted in her youth, when her own father, a brilliant but chronically unsuccessful professor of history, had drilled into her, "Jasmine, the world forgets raw talent, but it celebrates the illusion of success. Be smart, but let others shine if you want to survive." This sentence had become her mantra. She had surrendered her light to Sterling because she thought they would survive in prosperity together. She had extinguished her own light to let him shine. Now, looking at his radiant, ice-cold face, Jasmine felt only emptiness, an endless plain in her chest. She was determined to break this invisible pact. The thought of the impending divorce, of the necessity of reorganizing her life, was overwhelming. The ballroom was full, a clamor of voices, the clinking of glasses. Muted music created an atmosphere of light gaiety and ostentatious, almost obscene wealth. The sorrow Jasmine felt had a history spanning 7 silent years, years in which she had stifled her own voice, her kinetic rage, within the dry, sterile walls of their home. She thought back to her small, almost overgrown backyard, where she had once planned to build a small retreat and set up her own analysis room to finally write a book on macroeconomics. She had even drafted the title, "The Silent Architecture of the Market." The book was meant to give her back her lost recognition, a monument to her suppressed talent. But Sterling had laughed, that loud, dismissive laugh that left no air for dreams, that drenched all budding hopes with toxic scorn. "A book, Jazz? Don't be childish. You're my backbone, my invisible brain. Who else is going to worry about my career? Who else is going to make the numbers sing, if not you, my boring Jasmine?" he had said. And in his eyes there wasn't even a spark of shame, only the unconcealed, greedy demand of an owner. Instead, he had remodeled the retreat into a glittering wet bar for his business partners, a place that reeked of cheap Triumph and expensive scotch, a monument to his ego. That promise, that unlived dream, remained like a wilting rose in her heart. Only her elderly neighbor, Ms. Lois Jones, who meticulously tended her small yard and whose windows faced their retreat, had noticed Jasmine's secret tears in the shadow of the magnolias. Ms. Jones, a woman in her 80s with hands that smelled of earth and truth, was the only honest soul in Jasmine's sterile life. She was the unvarnished voice of nature against the artificiality of the financial world. "You know, young lady," Ms. Jones had once said, with her rough but warm voice, handing her a mug of strong chamomile tea. The tea tasted of the herbs she grew herself, not the polished surfaces of Sterling's world. "You can't step on withered flowers anymore, but you can remove them to make room for new growth in the garden. Life is like my rose garden. It doesn't tolerate stagnant love. It requires care or a clean cut. Sterling. He is a nettle, Jasmine. He takes your space and your light. Cut him out before he overwhelms you." Ms. Jones added, looking at Jasmine's sad face, "I once had a cactus. It never bloomed because I kept it in too small a pot and didn't want to see that it needed a bigger one. Sterling is doing the same thing to you." These words, simple and profound, now echoed in Jasmine's soul. Sterling approached her table. His face glowed with expectation and smugness. He exuded a mix of expensive cologne and unrestrained ambition. "Everything is going great, my Jazz. Our division raised the most donations," he said, leaning toward her, but his gaze was already sweeping the room, ensuring he was being seen. "That's good, Sterling," she replied. Her voice was hollow and distant as she tried to force a smile. "Yes, good. And I thought of something for the auction. A surprise." His voice was boastful and self-satisfied, the tone of a man convinced he would capture everyone's eyes. She already knew that such a surprise usually led to embarrassment or even shame, but this time she sensed something else, the announcement of the final public humiliation, yet the power to stop him had long abandoned her. It was the silence of resignation, burrowed deep into her bones, a deadly apathy. The auctioneer announced the start of the main bidding segment. Lots rotated, rare wines, trips to elite resorts, exclusive artwork. Sterling repeatedly raised his bidding paddle, demonstrating his generosity until it was time for his surprise. He stepped onto the stage and confidently took the microphone from the auctioneer's hand. The stage light was so bright it seemed to wash out the flaws in his character. His white shirt looked almost like a suit of successful armor, unblemished and provocative. The room fell silent in anticipation of another announcement from the successful department head. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began. His voice was loud and clear. "I want to present a very special lot. It is not purely material, but I am sure it is very tempting for those seeking new experiences, something unique." He paused meaningfully, letting his gaze wander through the room, seeking confirmation of his irresistibility. He reveled in the silence he had caused. Jasmine felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew what was coming. It was the final nail in the coffin of their marriage illusion, a blow that would be harder than any physical pain, because it aimed directly at her most vulnerable spot, her need for recognition. She fixed her eyes on a spot on the dark wooden floor, inhaling the faint scent of old wax and cold champagne. "Well, I present to you lot number 27, Sterling said, pointing dramatically to her table. His finger was an accusation. "Dinner with my very boring wife." His words carried not just irony, but open, cruel mockery. The entire room briefly froze, but then erupted in booming laughter. Sterling smiled, satisfied with the effect, as if he had just said the funniest thing in his life. He tilted his head, as if expecting deafening applause for this courage. Jasmine felt the blood rush to her face and then immediately drain away, leaving an icy void. Boring wife. The humiliation completely overwhelmed her. She felt hundreds of eyes fixed on her table, where she crouched, slumped like a defeated warrior. The laughter swelled, becoming an approving, deafening chorus of mockery, an echo of his own hurtful words. It sounded in her ears like the cracking of the ice field she had stood on for years. She saw the veiled schadenfreude in the eyes of the women, who had always viewed her as Sterling's competitor, and the contempt in the glances of the men who condemned Sterling for his poor taste. Even the corporate leadership seated at the central tables smiled. No one saw anything wrong with it, just a funny, if slightly reckless joke. Sterling stood on the stage, basking in the glow of the general ridicule that came at her expense. "Starting bid, gentlemen, just $1, Sterling chanted. His voice was lightly laced with scorn. Jasmine closed her eyes. The urge to sink into the floor, to dissolve, was overwhelming. She felt her hands trembling, her heart pounding wildly, a quick, panicked drumbeat. This was worse than all the sleepless nights, worse than all the credit he had taken for her work. It was a public crucifixion, a display of her as something worthless, boring, an object auctioned off for a symbolic price to elevate Sterling's own value. "Oh, $1? Does no one want to spend the evening with such an intellectual conversationalist who so wonderfully prepared my papers?" Sterling continued, his jokes becoming increasingly shallow and inappropriate. The air in the room became stuffy and hot, the scent of fear mixing with the lady's perfume. Tears stung her eyes, but she couldn't let them fall. Her throat spasmed shut, as if she were hanging from an invisible rope. Jasmine clenched her hands into fists beneath the table. Her fingernails dug into her palms. She felt no pain, only rage. Cold, pure, and burning all at once. This was the end of her patience, the end of her blind loyalty. "He has to fall," she thought with a clarity that made breathing easier. "He has to be as humiliated as I am now. This is no longer a divorce. This is my justice." In that moment, something tore inside her. Not like a fine thread, but like a thick, rusted cable connecting her to this man and this life. $5, someone shouted from the crowd. "10, cried another, and the voices merged into a mocking choir. Jasmine looked at Sterling. He looked back at her, but there was no spark of remorse in his eyes, only triumph, the taste of victory. It became clear to her that she had always been just a backdrop for him, a useful tool, an object to be ridiculed to demonstrate his own importance. Suddenly the laughter ceased. The room froze. The silence was so dense one could hear the attendees breathing. From the back rows, where the truly significant, unapproachable, invited guests sat, a tall, imposing man rose. He wore an impeccable dark gray suit that absorbed the light and underscored his authority. His posture was regal, his gaze sharp, cool, and piercing. It was Dr. Silas Thorne, known in business circles as the Architect, a master headhunter, a man who could track down any talent and win it for any company by realigning careers. His presence at the auction was unexpected and honored the event. $100,000, his voice boomed, loud and distinct as thunder in the stunning silence. The amount was monstrous. The number acted like a physical force, stifling the mockery in its infancy. The room was utterly quiet. No one had expected such a turn. Sterling on stage looked dumbfounded. His smug smile had slipped away. His mouth was slightly open. The silence seemed to steal his breath. Dr. Thorne slowly, almost majestically, strode down the aisle, his gaze fixed firmly on Jasmine. Every step was filled with dignity and unwavering self-assurance. The entire atmosphere around him seemed to crackle with electricity. The tension was almost physically palpable. He moved with the controlled calm of a hunter who knows his prey will not escape him. He stopped at Jasmine's table, extended his hand to her, and said in a deep, resonant voice, "Pardon me, Mrs. Vance. Dr. Thorne?" Jasmine looked up at him. There was no pity in his eyes, no curiosity, only respect and a deep, unobtrusive understanding. It was as if he had seen not only her work, but her entire suppressed existence and calculated her true market value. As if in a dream, she placed her trembling hand in his. His touch was firm and cool, but not cold. He helped her stand up. Sensing thousands of eyes on her, Jasmine straightened. The cold rage within her gave way to a razor-sharp, merciless realization. She was no longer a commodity, but a valuable resource, whose price had just risen from $1 to $100,000. "Such talent should not be wasted," Dr. Thorne said loudly, looking at Sterling, who was still standing on the stage with his mouth open, clutching the microphone. "I am bidding here not only for dinner, ladies and gentlemen, but for the intellectual integrity and the priceless labor that this gentleman has just auctioned off for $1. His words were addressed to the entire room, but only Jasmine understood their true, devastating meaning. It hadn't been about a dinner, it was about her invaluable worth, which Sterling had sold for $1. A few weeks ago, when despair had become her constant companion, when every success Sterling claimed for himself echoed in her soul as a screaming injustice, Jasmine had made a decision. In a fit of desperation and vague hope for something better, she had gathered all her work, all the reports, presentations, and analytical evaluations she had prepared for Sterling, even those he had dismissively rejected as too complicated, and sent them to Dr. Thorne, whose reputation as a talent scout she knew. It was her cry for justice, a message in a bottle she had thrown into the ocean of the business world. She hadn't expected a reply. It was more a last act of self-respect, but the answer had come, and now he stood before her like a savior, rescuing her from this humiliation. A savior who had priced her dignity at a figure that overshadowed Sterling's entire career. She had thrown her own lifeline, and he had grasped it. Dr. Thorne gently but firmly turned her toward the exit. The room was still silent, not knowing how to react. Sterling was speechless, immobile. He stared after the departing Jasmine as if seeing a ghost that embodied his own downfall. "We will speak tomorrow morning," Dr. Thorne said softly as they left the room. "Your resignation is already prepared. You just need to sign. This is the last humiliation you will have to endure." He added, "An excellent offer awaits you, Mrs. Vance. A life in which you are no longer a boring wife, but the architect of your own success." Jasmine merely nodded, unable to utter a word. She felt a massive, stony burden fall from her shoulders. The expensive fabric of her dress now felt feather-light. This was not just a walk out of the ballroom. It was the irrevocable exit from her old life, an act of liberation. Outside, a cool, fresh autumn wind blew, driving the stale smell of wealth and vanity from her lungs. She inhaled deeply. The air smelled of rain and a new beginning, of freedom and wet stone. She got into Dr. Thorne's car, whose interior smelled of leather and cool efficiency. She did not look back at the brightly lit window of the ballroom where her old cage had stood. In the morning, Jasmine did not sleep. She packed her things, her wardrobe, her beloved analysis books, and, most importantly, the collected notes that revealed the chaos in Sterling's system, the key to his downfall. Sterling was still asleep, deep in his careless, almost childlike slumber, apparently unaware that yesterday evening had become a point of no return. In the pre-dawn light, as the first gray rays filtered through the bedroom window, Jasmine looked at his face. It was the face of a man who had used her for years. No wave of nostalgia, no spark of old love stirred in her, only the cold, pure rage that had frozen into a steely resolve in her heart. She saw the fine lines of arrogance around his mouth, which she had once interpreted as a sign of his strength. Now she saw only weakness, the arrogance of a man who believed he could bend the laws of nature. Jasmine wrote a brief notice of resignation and placed it, along with a personal letter, on the living room table. The letter contained only one sentence, borrowed from Miss Jones. "I cut the nettle to make room for new growth in the garden. The rent for my sacrifice is now due, Sterling." She did not wait for him to wake up. She left the house, whose walls had been a prison for her for years, without looking back, without a sound that would betray her departure. The dawn greeted her with the metallic scent of wet asphalt and the promise of a new beginning. When Dr. Thorne met her at a cozy, elegant cafe in Midtown Manhattan, Jasmine felt surprisingly calm, almost unmoved. A slight, professional smile played on his face, yet there was seriousness and business acumen in his eyes. She immediately sensed this was a person who valued not only emotions, but performance and integrity. He wore a light scent of bergamot, sharp and clear. The scent stood in stark contrast to Sterling's heavy, sweet cologne. Dr. Thorne was the scent of truth. Sterling was the scent of illusion. "Have you made a decision, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, handing her the menu. "I resigned," she replied curtly, and it sounded like a judgment on her past life. For the first time in years, she didn't have to hide behind anyone. She didn't have to choose her words carefully not to hurt anyone's vanity. It was a breathtaking freedom to hear her own voice, now clear and without a tremor. "Excellent!" Dr. Thorne nodded, his gaze sweeping over her face, lingering for a moment on the determination in her eyes. He seemed to be assessing not only her professional qualities, but also her inner readiness for radical change, her capacity for rebirth. "You have caught fire, Mrs. Vance, and that is excellent motivation. I have already spoken with the management of Crestwood Capital Group, CCG. They are very interested in your experience and, shall we say, your unique knowledge. The position is that of Senior Lead Analyst, a completely new division that we will build under your leadership. Complete freedom of action, resources, a commensurate salary that triples your current income, plus results-based bonuses, and of course, full recognition of your contributions. No more boring wives and $1 bids." The last phrase was spoken without the slightest mockery, only with a hint of understanding and respect. Jasmine felt something happen inside her, as if the ice surrounding her soul was cracking and melting. For the first time in a long time, she felt valued, not as someone's appendage, but as an independent personality, a top-tier professional. "I accept," she replied, and her voice carried a steely resolve she hadn't expected from herself. This was not just an acceptance. It was a declaration of her right to a dignified life and career. Revenge would be the byproduct of the assent. "Wonderful." Dr. Thorne took a sip of coffee. "You can start immediately if you wish. We have already prepared your workspace. And by the way, Mr. Theodore Harrison, the CEO, is counting heavily on your help in a delicate matter. Vanguard Equity Solutions, your former colleagues. They are currently fighting actively for two large agricultural holdings, Golden Harvest Farms and Heartland AgriCorp. They are our main competitors in that segment, and they hold those clients with an iron fist. Your knowledge of them would be invaluable." A mischievous spark flashed in his eyes, and Jasmine understood that her revenge would not only be cold, but also very profitable. Jasmine smiled, and there was no warmth in that smile, only steely determination. She knew everything about those clients. She knew their needs, their weaknesses, their unfulfilled requests, because it was she who had prepared the reports and proposals for them, which Sterling had later defended with bravado, only slightly changing the wording. The architecture of his career was now in her hands, ready for demolition. Her first days at Crestwood Capital Group were like a bath in the clear, cold sea after years in a stuffy, warm room. Her new office was a temple of functionality, minimalist with lots of glass and a panoramic view of the harbor where the large ships lay, a symbol of the wide world of possibilities. She enjoyed the clean space, smelling faintly of fresh paint and polished wood. There was no stuffy air of Sterling's ego here, and no trace of his dominant cologne. Here, there was only her performance. Dr. Thorne, who now proved to be a true mentor, not only introduced her to her duties, but also fostered her visions. "You have a gift, Mrs. Vance," he told her once during a meeting where she presented a complex risk assessment. "You don't just see the numbers. You see the people behind them and the mistakes that arise from arrogance and complacency. Use that knowledge. See it not as revenge, but as strategic justice, the payment for your suppressed creativity. You are only taking back what was stolen from you." This concept of retribution achieved through superior performance became Jasmine's inner code. She remembered every unsatisfied demand, every complaint about bureaucracy and slowness at Vanguard Equity Solutions, every missed opportunity, every sigh of disappointment that Sterling preferred to ignore to avoid disrupting his peace. She knew that the agricultural holdings were looking not only for financial services, but for a partner who understood their seasonal specifics, their modernization and expansion plans, and their specific needs for farm machinery and fertilizers. Sterling had scorned the complexity of rural business. Jasmine saw the gold mine in it. "I have a few ideas, Dr. Thorne," she said, and her voice carried cold confidence. VES is too cumbersome and too fixed on its own standard schemes to recognize their true needs. They offer general solutions, while Golden Harvest Farms and Heartland AgriCorp have long been looking for an individual approach, more flexible credit terms, and most importantly, innovative investment solutions that their current partners cannot provide. We can offer them not only financial services, but a complex development strategy that allows them to reach a new level, optimize costs, and increase profits. If you're enjoying Jasmine's story so far, tap the like button. It really helps me see who's following along. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Betty's Stories for more. Now, let's continue. Jasmine's real transformation is just beginning. The next day, to the surprise of colleagues at Vanguard Equity Solutions, Jasmine's first stop was the Human Resources Department. "Mrs. Vance, did you need something?" asked the HR director, Ms. Renee Jackson, visibly surprised by her early visit. Her look was full of curiosity and slight concern. She was holding a lavender stress ball, trying to cope with the stress prevalent in Sterling's division. "I have submitted my resignation," Jasmine said firmly, handing her a folded sheet of paper. There wasn't the slightest shadow of doubt on her face, only the calmness of absolute certainty. Ms. Jackson took it, scanned it, and her eyebrows shot up in astonishment. "But why? You are a valuable employee. And Mr. Vance, he is counting on you. The quarterly report is due soon, you know that. We are paralyzed without you." Genuine concern for the company, not for Sterling, resonated in her voice. "I ask that the formalities be completed as quickly as possible," Jasmine interrupted, as she did not wish for discussions or justifications. "I don't require any transition period or other formalities. The resignation is by mutual agreement." She knew her rights, and her determination was unshakable. Faced with her stubbornness, Ms. Jackson merely shrugged. "All right, I will forward it to the management, but I think Mr. Vance will be very, very upset." The anticipation of impending disaster was in her words. Jasmine said nothing, only nodded, and left the office. She felt free, as if heavy, invisible chains had fallen from her hands. The doors of the prison were now closed behind her. Sterling woke up late, with a slight headache and a feeling of vague unease, like cats scratching at his soul. The sun was already high in the sky, illuminating their bedroom unusually brightly, where Jasmine's usual morning hustle was absent. The house smelled cold and empty. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and Jasmine's light citrus perfume was gone, replaced by the stale odor of last night. He smelled his own failure. He went to the kitchen, expecting to see her, but she wasn't there. A carefully sealed envelope lay on the table. He opened it, read the resignation and the letter. It was short, emotionless, informing him of her departure and her desire to cut off all contact. No explanations, no accusations, just the dry, unmerciful statement of fact. The absence of any emotion was Sterling's worst accusation. "What the hell?" he muttered aloud. His voice sounded alien in the empty apartment. "Is she kidding? Is she offended by that stupid joke?" But it had only been a joke, a small display of his public dominance. His brain refused to accept the reality and tried to reduce everything to a small argument, to childish resentment. He couldn't even recall the events of last night precisely. Alcohol had fogged his memory, but the phrase "boring wife" and the mocking laughter of the room surfaced in fragments, causing only irritation, not remorse. Sterling tried to call Jasmine, but her number was unreachable. He was furious. How could she do this to him? Abandon him at the most important moment? The quarterly report, which was crucial for his career, was not finished. All his essential analytical evaluations, charts, forecasts, all of it was in Jasmine's head, in her notes, in her talent that he had utilized so skillfully without ever giving a thought to the fact that it was her work. It suddenly and devastatingly dawned on him how heavily he depended on her inconspicuous, diligent work. This realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The panic began. It was the fear of the man whose training wheels had been taken away. When he arrived at work, Sterling rushed straight to his computer, trying to navigate the files Jasmine had managed. Opening one folder after another with names like VSCO3 2025 Quarterly Report, he found that many were password protected, and others were in a state that made them impossible to understand without her explanations. These were not just spreadsheets, but complex interweavings of data, drafts of future models that were just a chaotic set of numbers to him, meaningless and alien. Panic began to constrict his throat, an icy lump that squeezed his lungs. He felt as if he were lost in a deep, dark forest where every step could lead to an abyss, and the compass and maps remained in the hands of the person he had thoughtlessly driven away. The smell of the office, once the scent of his triumph, now smelled of paper and impending bankruptcy. "Ms. Jackson, has Mrs. Vance really left?" he asked the HR director, barely able to hide the tremor in his voice, trying to give it a casual tone that fooled no one. He was sweating cold. "Yes, Mr. Vance, the resignation has been signed. She won't be here today. By the way, she requested all documents by mutual agreement to waive the notice period," Ms. Jackson replied dryly, closing her folder and turning away. To her, he was just another tyrant who had lost a valuable employee. "But why? Because of yesterday? It was just a joke. And the report? The quarterly report!" Sterling raised his voice. It tipped into hysteria, betraying his utter desperation. "Mr. Vance, that is not within my jurisdiction. I am just doing my job," Ms. Jackson answered dryly, closing her folder and turning away. For her, he was just another self-important man who had lost a valuable employee. Sterling wandered through his office, trying to piece together the scattered data, but nothing worked. His talent was presenting ideas, talking, selling what someone else had created. Without Jasmine, he turned out to be completely helpless, like a puppet without strings, like an engine without fuel. Every file, every line of code, every spreadsheet was dead to him without her explanation, encrypted with a code that was invisible to him. He felt the ground being pulled out from under his feet, how his life, built on someone else's work, began to crumble. The division he had been so proud of now looked like a house of cards that threatened to collapse at the slightest breeze, and he himself was its weakest link. He had to wander around for hours just to find the data that Jasmine would have found in minutes. The cold sweat of failure covered his forehead. His hands trembled, and he nearly shattered the expensive designer lamp on his desk. Meanwhile, the devastating blow was executed with icy precision. Jasmine, at her sun-drenched desk at CCG, finalized the last presentation. In just a few days, she had developed a strategy that exposed and corrected Sterling's errors of the past few years. She had transformed the client's quiet complaints into clear, profitable solutions. She felt no joy, but a deep, satisfying calm. It was the calm of a surgeon who had pulled a rotten tooth. The result was quick to follow. Within 1 week of a series of meetings held by Jasmine, together with the Crestwood Capital Group team, Vanguard Equity Solutions' 2 largest clients, Golden Harvest Farms and Heartland AgriCorp, announced their switch to Crestwood Capital Group. This was not just a departure. It was an exemplary flight caused by the incompetence of the competitors, a devastating blow to Sterling's firm. They lost not only huge contracts that brought in fabulous profits, but also the reputation that had been built over years and was now instantly dissolving. The entire industry was talking about Crestwood Capital Group as the new strong player capable of changing the rules of the game, and about Vanguard Equity Solutions as a company losing its edge and falling behind the times. Sterling became synonymous with a department head who had sold his company's brain for $1. Panic erupted at Vanguard Equity Solutions. Chaos reigned in the finance division, which Sterling couldn't control. The numbers didn't align. Forecasts collapsed. Investors began to worry. Sterling, unable to complete the quarterly report, wandered between divisions, trying to shift the blame onto everyone but himself. His face was pale, his eyes glittered feverishly from lack of sleep and stress. He barely ate. His clothes hung loosely on his body, once so impeccable. He lost the aura of his former success within days. "How can this be?" he roared at his subordinates, gesticulating wildly. "Don't you see that that we have problems? Where is the data on these clients? Why did we lose them? Why couldn't anyone keep them?" He searched for culprits but found only confusion and helplessness in the eyes of his employees. But his subordinates could only shrug. Without Jasmine's system, without her analytical acumen, they were lost. Her absence felt like the amputation of a vital organ. His division was paralyzed, and without his right hand, Jasmine, he had accomplished nothing. The news of the loss of the key clients was the final straw. He felt the office walls closing in, his lungs unable to draw enough air, as if he were suffocating on his own failure. He had to lean on the office doorframe to keep from collapsing. The call from his boss, Mr. Theodore Harrison, was short and sharp, sounding like a death knell. There was not the slightest shadow of former politeness in his voice, only cold fury. "Mr. Vance, get up here immediately, and don't try to invent another excuse. I need facts, not one of your fairy tales." Sterling entered his boss's office, feeling his legs turn to jelly. Every step was heavy, as if he were walking through quicksand. Mr. Harrison sat at his desk. His face was stone, his eyes flashed with disappointment and anger. An ominous folder with the Crestwood Capital Group logo lay on the desk, all too familiar, like a brand of shame. Beside it lay papers with the contracts from Golden Harvest and Heartland Agricorp, but already with different stamps, different numbers, and a completely different degree of elaboration. The room smelled of cold coffee and bitter defeat. "What is going on here, Mr. Vance?" Mr. Harrison said. His voice was deep and menacing, like the harbinger of a storm that had already broken. "We have lost 2 of our largest clients. 2. That is losses in the tens of millions that you have inflicted on the company. Those are reputation losses that no money in the world can measure, and they have undermined the trust of our partners. Can you explain this? I expect a reasonable explanation. No more empty phrases." He looked at Sterling with a piercing gaze that seemed to bore right through him. Sterling began to mumble something about unfair competition, about a difficult market situation, about Crestwood Capital Group engaging in dumping. But his boss interrupted him abruptly, almost shouting, and slammed his fist on the table. The impact made the cup on the desk rattle. "Enough, Mr. Vance. That is a lie, and you know it. Look at this." He shoved the folder sharply across the desk. It slid across the polished surface directly into Sterling's hands, like a venomous snake dragging him into the abyss. "This is your strategy report, the report you presented to our former clients. This is not dumping. This is brilliant analysis. This is a strategy that considers every little detail, every nuance that you had no idea about. Do you recognize the handwriting?" Sterling took the folder. He flipped through the pages, and his eyes widened in horror. Charts, analytical evaluations, even the phrasing, the specific turns of phrase he had so often heard from Jasmine but ignored, all of it was painfully familiar. This was a report that only Jasmine could write. Her unique style, her precision, her profound knowledge of financial processes. It was her work, her soul, her talent, now working against him, against the company that had humiliated her, against his own once successful career. That's impossible," he gasped, feeling a lump rise in his throat, preventing him from breathing. "It is possible, Mr. Vance, and more than that, it is a fact. You lost a key employee, a person who, as it turns out, did all the work for you. All your brilliant reports, all the successful presentations, all your strategic decisions, that was her work. And now that person is working for our competitors, using her knowledge of us to destroy us." Mr. Harrison's voice filled with rage. His face was red with indignation. "You completely ruined her division. You put the company in jeopardy. Without her talent, Mrs. Vance could have made millions for us. But with you, she led us into the red. You let her go. You made a public mockery of her in front of the entire company, and she turned out to be the only one keeping your pathetic division afloat. You didn't just lose an employee, you lost the company's brain. The price of your joke was the collapse of your entire career. Sterling tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat and refused to come out. His humiliation was complete and total. He understood that it was pointless to argue, that every word he spoke would just be an empty sound. All his schemes, his assumed merits, his lies, all of it collapsed in an instant, like a house of cards he had so carefully built on foreign shoulders, on foreign talent. "I have made a decision, Mr. Vance," Mr. Harrison said. His voice became cold and official, like it was carved in stone. "You are terminated for repeated incompetence, for the loss of a key employee, and for causing colossal damage to the company's reputation and financial standing. Your position is already being filled by someone else who is hopefully not as foolish and self-satisfied. You can pack your things and leave the premises within 1 hour. Access to the system will be blocked immediately. And Mr. Vance, you can forget about any references. Your career in this industry, at least in this city, is over." Sterling's world collapsed. He left his boss's office as if in a trance, feeling invisible to everyone. Every step was heavy, as if he were walking through quicksand. Colleagues, normally so friendly and flattering, now turned away, avoiding his gaze. He heard muffled whispers, saw the contemptuous glances they threw at him. No one wanted to look at a man who was in the spotlight yesterday and was broken today. He, the successful department head, the pride of the division, was now a nobody, an outcast, a man who had lost everything: his career ascent, his social status, his reputation. Everything crumbled to dust in one evening because of one stupid, cynical decision, because of a single humiliating joke. Returning to the empty apartment, Sterling felt a sharp, burning pain in his chest. He had lost not only his job, not only the money, but also Jasmine, his foundation, his support, the person who had made him successful, who had been his invisible brain. Loneliness had moved into his house. The apartment, which had once been enlivened by Jasmine's quiet presence, now smelled of must and stale air. The whole house seemed to condemn him. Sterling wandered through the rooms. He saw the empty space in Jasmine's closet where her elegant dresses had hung, and felt a wave of shock. He had not just been left, he had been erased. He went to the backyard and saw the wet bar he had built, his place of ego. It was cold and still. The coldness crept into his bones. Miss Lois Jones stood at her fence pruning her roses. Their eyes met. She did not nod to him, but only looked at him with a gaze so infinitely sad and reproachful that it almost choked Sterling. It was the look of a judge who had long since passed his sentence, based on the growth and decay she had observed over the years. He turned and fled into the protective darkness of the house. A paralyzing silence reigned in the apartment, which had once seemed pleasant to him, but now pressed against his temples, screaming of his loneliness, of his complete and unconditional failure. He dialed her number again and again, but only heard the indifferent voice of the answering machine. "The subscriber is currently unavailable." Again and again, pointlessly. She had burned all the bridges. He tried to fill the voicemail, pleaded, apologized, but it was all too late. He tried calling mutual acquaintances and friends, those he counted as his circle, but no one answered or they replied evasively. "Sterling, well, you understand the situation is kind of awkward. You messed it up yourself," one mumbled, and Sterling heard not sympathy in his voice, but hidden schadenfreude. "Sorry, I'm really busy, truly don't have time right now," another quickly replied, and Sterling understood that he was no longer the successful Sterling, but just Sterling, whom no one needed. His reputation was destroyed. No one wanted anything to do with a man who had so betrayed his company and humiliated his wife. His image as the successful Sterling was trampled, and in its place remained only a broken shell. He had learned the bitter lesson of social decline. Sterling sat in the empty apartment, surrounded by a silence louder than any scream, any accusation. He saw before him the images of last night, the laughter of the room. his own smug face, then the appearance of Dr. Thorne, the determined gesture, Jasmine's hand in another man's, and her look of cold rage that he hadn't understood then, and that distance, that icy determination in her eyes that he hadn't attributed any significance to at the time. He remembered how she had worked at night, how she had calmly explained complex schemes to him, how she had believed in him, how she had been his loyal shadow. And he had betrayed her, humiliated her, made a public joke of her, and was now paying the full price for it. On the coffee table, where her beloved bouquet of flowers used to stand when she still tried to bring some coziness into their home, lay a small note written in Jasmine's hand, which he had overlooked on his way out this morning. "I wish you exactly the same happiness that you gave me. Think about it." And now, in this deadly silence, those words sounded like a final judgment to him. He was lonely, empty, and before him lay only bottomless emptiness. He had done it to himself. It was a cold, unmerciful revenge that had led to the complete collapse of his life. He was publicly humiliated, stripped of everything he owned, and now had to taste the full extent of the loneliness he had created. He was alone, absolutely alone, consumed by the flame of his own failure, and there was no one who could save him. The future seemed empty, frightening, without the slightest glimmer of light, and that was his own doing. His life lay in ruins, and all he had left was to wander alone through them, remembering how he had single-handedly destroyed everything he possessed. He, Sterling Vance, the man who made a career, now had nothing left, and that was only the beginning of his suffering, the cold, final lesson about the true value of love and respect. 2 months later. The autumn had turned into a clear, frosty winter. Jasmine sat in her new office at CCG. She was the architect. Her team was loyal, her success undeniable. The name Vance, once linked to Sterling, was now only synonymous in the industry with her precision and strength. The scent of polished wood, clear glass, and freshly brewed, strong espresso filled her room. She had rented a small, modest apartment with a balcony overlooking a small park. The furniture was simple, but it was hers alone. No expensive velvet, no stifling expectations. One Saturday afternoon, she drove back to her old house, not out of nostalgia, but to settle one last matter. She needed the final boxes of her professional books that Sterling had put in the garage. As she parked her car on the roadside, she saw Miss Lois Jones in her yard. The old woman was deep in her work, surrounded by a sea of dry leaves and the bare branches of the roses. Jasmine no longer felt rage, only a slight, almost academic sadness about the futility of the lost years. She walked to the fence. "Ms. Jones?" The old lady slowly straightened up. Her eyes, sharp as ever, recognized Jasmine immediately. There was no surprise in her gaze, only deep, silent satisfaction. "Ah, Jasmine," she said. "I knew you'd be back. I was waiting for it." She waved Jasmine into her yard. The air smelled of damp earth and the promise of the next spring. "I'm just picking up some books. I just wanted to see you and say thank you," Jasmine said softly. "Your words, they were the cut." Miss Jones smiled, a smile that deepened the lines around her eyes. "Every garden needs a winter, Jasmine. A time of hardness to recover for the new bloom. Your winter is over," she added. "You see, Jasmine, the rose that is not pruned goes wild and spends its energy on unnecessary growth. Sterling was like such a rose, too much show, no substance. But you freed yourself and are now a plant striking new roots." She pointed with her rough, work-worn hand to a spot in the yard. "See what happened to the wet bar? It's empty. It's cold." "Yes, Sterling is no longer here," Jasmine said. "He lost everything." "That is the law of the garden, Jasmine. You reap what you sow. He sowed loneliness, and he will reap loneliness, but you made a clean cut and prepared the soil for something true." Miss Jones looked deep into her eyes. "How are you really, Jasmine?" Not the architect, but the woman. Jasmine felt tears well up in her eyes for the first time in months. They were not tears of pain, but of relief. "I am alone, but I am not lonely," she whispered. "I have my work, which is mine, and for the first time I have found my own worth. I am building my own foundation, and it is stable." "That is the rebirth," Ms. Jones said, placing a hand on her arm, a touch that was surprisingly firm and warm. "Don't forget, young lady, the greatest happiness is being your own gardener. Tend your new roots. Revenge is just the necessary weeding. Life is the growth that follows. Don't be afraid of the cold earth, Jasmine. It is the cradle of life." Jasmine nodded. She understood. The liberation was not losing Sterling. The liberation was discovering her own strength. With a smile that was deep and genuine this time, she said goodbye to the old gardener and walked toward the house. She felt the cold wind, but now it seemed to cleanse her soul instead of freezing it. She was the architect, and she was the gardener. Her new life had just begun. 3 years later, the legacy of Justice Jasmine, now known as Dr. Jasmine Reed, stood on the stage of the annual Financial Congress. She no longer wore midnight blue velvet, but a gray pantsuit that radiated authority but didn't stifle. She spoke not about numbers, but about the architecture of stable success, a philosophy she had established at CCG herself. Her voice was clear, her presence undeniable. She was the woman whose talent had changed the game. After her presentation, as the applause subsided, Dr. Thorne approached her. "Brilliant, Jazz. We are proud. That is the true revenge, superiority, not destruction." "The destruction came by itself," Jasmine replied softly. "I just reorganized the building blocks." She had heard about Sterling. He had never gotten back on his feet after his termination. He worked as a consultant for small, obscure firms, struggled with debt, and desperately tried to call his old circle of acquaintances. He had learned that illusion doesn't last long without substance. His loneliness had become so deep that he often sought out the wet bar in his abandoned yard as his only refuge. It no longer smelled of expensive scotch, but of damp wood and despair. However, Jasmine had planned one last, instructive act. With her new, more than 3 times higher salary, she bought back the house that Sterling had to sell because of his debts. Not to live in it, but to give it to Ms. Lois Jones. She drove to the house one last time. Ms. Jones was already at the fence. She did not look surprised. "I heard you're the new owner," Ms. Jones said and smiled. "A beautiful gesture, Jasmine." "It's not a gift, Ms. Jones. It's a foundation. The foundation for undiscovered talent. I will tear down the wet bar and build a small library there where young people can study in peace, right where Sterling celebrated his ignorance." "And the garden?" Ms. Jones asked. "The garden belongs to you," Jasmine said. "As a token of my gratitude and a symbol of rebirth. You will teach there that life requires care and not vanity." Ms. Jones nodded, her eyes teary. "That is the most beautiful form of justice, Jasmine. What was stolen becomes a tool for good. Life is the highest lesson." Jasmine drove away, looking in the rearview mirror. She saw Ms. Jones in her small yard, ready to nurture the new roots. She took a deep breath. The cold wind of success now seemed warm. She was no longer Sterling's boring wife. She was Dr. Jasmine Reed, the architect of her own life and the gardener of her own soul. And that was her true, priceless triumph. She had arrived. You know, when I look back now, I realize that sometimes life doesn't break you to destroy you. It breaks you open, so you can finally see who you really are. For years I thought love meant sacrifice and silence, that strength meant holding everything together no matter how much it hurt. But the truth is, strength is not about enduring pain. It's about having the courage to say, enough. It's walking away from what dims your light, even when your heart trembles. Losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me, because in that loss, I found myself. I learned that peace is not given by others. It's built inside you, step by step, with every boundary you set and every dream you protect. So if you're listening right now and feel trapped, remember, your story isn't over. You can start again. You can rebuild from ashes and rise stronger than before. I'm living proof of that. If you agree with me and liked my story, show it by giving this video a like. Let's see how many of us are out there. I'm really curious, from which city and at what time are you listening? Write it in the comments, and if you'd like to support my journey, you can send me a small donation. Thank you for listening and for sharing your precious time with me. For more life stories like this, check out the other videos on my channel and subscribe. On the screen, you'll see 2 new life stories I'm sure will touch your heart. Click one and start listening right away. With love, Betty.